Well, Winnipeg's inner city is in crisis mode. Now, that is according to advocates who say poverty, safety concerns, and a crumbling infrastructure are all to blame. While there have been efforts made to recover the area, there's a new report that says more is needed. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives is calling for a radical transformation of the area. This report is out today, and I've been looking at it this morning and reading the details. It says, quote, this year's report argues that more profound transformation is needed to achieve genuine social and economic justice in Winnipeg's inner city, end quote. So to talk more about what is in this, the official launch later today, Sarah Cooper is here. Sarah teaches city planning at the University of Manitoba. She's the lead researcher behind the CCPA's State of the Inner City report, and on the line now. Good morning.
Good morning.
So I gave sort of a little bit of the headline there, but tell me a little bit about the description you came to in this report for what our inner city looks like right now in Winnipeg.
Yeah, so, the inner city it's had trouble for a while. There's been concentrated poverty in the area for decades. There's been a lot of attention to it. And from the 1980s to the early 2000s, there was federal investment, provincial investment, municipal investment, all of which helped to generate a network of community organizations through the inner city. There was consistent long-term support. And now in the last decade or so, that's gone away. It's been the pandemic in particular was really hard on the inner city. There were cuts to provincial spending on social supports. And I think a lot of people have noticed that there's been increased visible homelessness, there's increased addictions, a lack of safety, overdoses, all of that kind of thing. So as we look at the inner city, what we're saying, what we hear from the pandemic is that we have to recover from the pandemic. We're going back to business as usual, but that's not what's going to work for the inner city. We need a transformation that's really going to focus on building healthy and safe communities for everybody.
When I was reading through this, one of the things that comes up repeatedly is that people don't trust the systems in place that are there purportedly to solve things right now, but that the solutions are already coming from community organizations that are at the grassroots. And this report actually has a call to action to lean into that. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time, governments, programs that they offer, EIA, housing, those kinds of things, they can seem a little bit distant when you're trying to figure out your day-to-day life. And the community organizations in the inner city, they're the ones who will, help people figure out how to navigate complicated systems. They help people with paperwork. And they're visible on a day-to-day level within the community. And I think there's a level of trust there that there isn't necessarily with this kind of abstract, higher-level government. So the call for action has two main pieces. One is a call for investment, for funding to support the inner city. And then the other piece is that it should be led by inner city, Indigenous and community leadership, because the communities of the inner city, the people who live there, they know what they need. And so any planning, any decisions for the inner city really need to be based on leadership from those inner city communities and organizations.
So it's not just a dollar figure coming to support organizations in the inner city, or it is actually the organizations themselves would lead where those dollars go.
Mm-hmm. Finding some way to create, maybe it's a table, maybe it's some kind of decision-making council. I'm not sure what it would look like, but finding a way to engage that leadership, because so often it's a top-down kind of, we know it'll solve the problem, but it doesn't necessarily address the concerns of the people who are living there.
This is a big report, but there's a number of graphs and that outline who is actually living in our inner city, population changes, and what the makeup is of people in the inner city. Can you give us a little bit of information about the picture of, who calls our inner city home?
Yeah, well, it's a really diverse group of people. There are people who have lived there for generations. There are people who've moved there in the last 5 years. I think a couple of key points are that, first, the level of poverty in the inner city is much higher than in the city as a whole. So roughly almost 1 in 4 households in the inner city are considered to be low income, whereas for Winnipeg as a whole, it's about 13%. So that's a really important piece, that there's concentrated poverty, right, which needs a different kind of approach to address it. And then the second really important piece is that about 1 in 5 people in the inner city identify as Indigenous, compared with about just over 1 in 10 in the city as a whole. And that's particularly important because it means that the inner city is really an Indigenous space. It's an Indigenous community, and Indigenous people's distinct rights, including the right to self-determination, have not always been addressed, have not usually been addressed by governments. And so a large chunk of the challenges that are in the inner city, which are a direct result of colonialism, of residential schools, of governance that's been imposed, all of those kinds of things, those will only be addressed when Canadian governments get out of the way and Indigenous peoples, the community, are able to make decisions for themselves.
It's interesting because at one point there's a quote here that says from someone that works at the Grassroots, this is from the West Central Women's Resource Center, Lori English, quoted in the report, people who are on the margins and have been disrespected and discriminated against in systems don't trust systems. And yet the call to action is to sit down and have a roundtable. Do you think that real change is possible?
I think it is, but I think it's going to need a lot of very careful attention to process, attention to how the change happens. And that's why the call is for, having this roundtable, having this leadership from the community to direct governments, to give advice to governments about how to do the investment, how to do the programming, what kinds of changes are needed. Because, the communities know what they need, but it's a matter of making that happen in a way that hasn't happened previously.
What's the role for the private sector? Because there's also part of this report that says the private sector will not address these complex needs. So all levels of government must work with community leaders to do so. That sounds like the private sector has not taken a role. And is that a call to action for the private sector as well? Or how do you see the role there?
Well, I think, the private sector, of course, is concerned about these issues. We know that, the downtown biz, the exchange biz, they're all very involved in these kinds of conversations as well. And they have a lot of concern for what's happening in the area. But in terms of, addressing housing need, addressing food security, the private sector isn't going to do that because, they have a mandate. Their goal is to make money, and that's fine. Like that's what they do. But we need non-market solutions to address some of these more systemic kinds of issues that are simply not being addressed by the market. Housing, for example, if a household can't afford market rate housing, they're going to need a non-market solution.
As I mentioned, big report, big announcement coming up later today with even more detail. Thank you very much for being with us and giving us a first look.
Thank you very much.
That's Sarah Cooper. She teaches city planning at the University of Manitoba. She's the lead researcher behind CCPA's State of the Inner City report, coming out in detail later this morning.